Between 1964 and 1967, one man proved that the human mind was grossly underutilized. In one of the strangest scientific experiments ever carried out in human history, Ted Serios, a psychic photographer, showed how he could print things, not from a computer or any electronic device, but from his mind. This is the bizarre story of a bellhop who took the world of psychiatry by storm with his thoughtography practice. Although Ted made the concept of thoughtography popular in the 60s, its history dates back over a century. In 1910, a Japanese associate professor of psychology, Tomokichi Fukurai, began a series of tests on special subjects. Tomokichi was intrigued by clairvoyance, psychic energy, and other parapsychology ideologies. Little wonder he did not hesitate to work with a clairvoyant when the opportunity presented itself. Sometime in April that year, Tomokichi met Chizuko Mifune, a self-acclaimed clairvoyant. Mifune was a young woman in her 20s. Her parents were herbal medicine practitioners, so it was easy for her to pick up some of her folks' religious inclinations. When Mifune got married at 22, she moved in with her in-laws. This was a common practice at the time. While here, her life began to change. It is believed that her brother-in-law introduced her to hypnosis, an act that opened up the next phases of her life. Mifune's fascination with hypnosis led to a deeper exploration of her mind, and soon, she believed she was clairvoyant. I'm not exactly sure how her expertise in this area caught Tomokichi's attention, but it did. The professor soon invited her over for a session with him. Mifune believed she could read the content of letters in sealed envelopes, and this claim was tested before some witnesses. Of course, these pseudoscientific methods were frowned upon by Tomokichi's colleagues, but it didn't stop him. During one of the sessions with Mifune, he discovered something intriguing. Tomokichi found that photographs taken during his experiments with Mifune produced strange images. It appeared there were blurred figures other than Mifune in the same picture. No one was sure why this happened. Tomokichi was convinced this was an indication of his subject's power. It had to be some form of energy or essence from her soul. This is one of the first cases of inexplicable images appearing in a photograph. But as usual, there will always be critics, and these critics didn't believe in Mifune's ability as well as Tomokichi's research method. Over time, more people scrutinized Tomokichi's methods and his subject. During a session in September of 1910, the president of the Tokyo Imperial University, Baron Yamakawa Kinjiro, attended the event. During the meeting, Mifune was given sealed envelopes to read, which she did. The letters were supposed to have come from Yamakawa, but something happened. It was later discovered that Tomokichi wrote these letters. That's like going to a court case where the judge and juries are your friends. At this point, all skeptics were convinced that Mifune was a con artist. This was followed by great criticism from the media, where they called her a scam. Some people believe Tomokichi was blinded by his desire to prove his theories on parapsychology. As a result, his experiments did not have the necessary control measures. For instance, Mifune was allowed to stay with the envelopes without supervision. In other cases, she insisted on turning away from her audience whenever she wanted to read the content of the sealed envelopes. Just this one revelation turned even believers into critics. Later, Mifune sadly took her life. Although Tomokichi's research with Mifune led to her unfortunate demise, he continued his program. However, this time he delved into thoughtography, or ninja as the Japanese called it. He was now interested in the strange images that appeared on some of his photographic plates during his session with Mifune. Intrigued by this, the Japanese psychologist started to study this phenomenon deeply. Shortly afterward, he found another woman with claims to this strange ability, the ability to mentally reproduce their thoughts on an external surface. Her name was Ikuko Nagao. Tomokichi was convinced this was an unexplored aspect of psychology. He even published a book on it titled Clairvoyance and Thoughtography. However, the criticism of his works increased. More experts in that field believed the women he worked with were not sincere, but tricksters. As the pressure increased, Tomokichi was forced to resign from his position. In his writings, he expressed his pains at the disapproval of his scientific and academic community. He said, "After the publication of this book, I was disliked more and more by scientists in Japan. So much pressure was put upon me, and so difficult was it to continue my psychical research and keep my position as a professor at the Imperial University of Tokyo that I was obliged to resign at last." His resignation seemed to draw the curtain of his idea of parapsychology, but this would not remain so for long. Half a century after Tomokichi's adventure, the world of psychology was unprepared for what was about to hit it, but this time in the West. In Chicago, an unemployed bellhop was trying to find his feet after his recent job loss. Ted had discovered hypnosis as a hobby and found himself exploring exciting possibilities. After some years of developing this skill and practicing it before lots of people, it became clear that he had received a special gift. However, Ted Serios was in bad shape and not the kind of person you wanted in your space. He was an alcoholic, and some accounts say he was a petty thief, breaking into cars and robbing his victims. He had also been arrested on several occasions. This is probably why he remained jobless, as no one wanted to take in an ex-convict. In any case, Ted's hypnotic abilities had grown. By this time, he could project images from his mind onto surfaces. He started out using a box camera, but soon evolved into Polaroid films. After almost 60 years, Tomokichi's hypothesis on thoughtography was making a comeback. As the hypnotist's fame spread, more people became aware of this mysterious ability. Although no one is sure when he learned this, it was impossible to ignore. In the years that followed leading up to 1964, Ted's skill was easily recognized as a strange phenomenon worthy of study. It wasn't long before a Denver-based psychiatrist, Jewel Eisenbud, became aware of him and reached out. Eisenbud was fascinated by Ted's strange powers, and in 1964, an alliance was formed between the two. Over time, the duo produced about 1,000 pictures using a Polaroid camera. Some accounts say the images were several thousand, and there was no way the photos could be manipulated since there was no need for a dark room for image production. This was what amazed a lot of people. Ted's pictures came in all forms. He began with what Eisenbud called blackies and whiteys. The blackies were completely dark, while the whiteys were, just as the name implied, bright. This was a strange phenomenon, as it proved that for the whiteys, the pictures were overexposed to light, while the blackies were not exposed to any form of light at all. None of these conditions of total or zero exposure to light were possible in the room where the experiments were carried out. Eisenbud was certain he had found a major link between the human mind and some of its endless possibilities. He wasted no time setting up a test environment where interested persons could watch a man print pictures from his mind. This was revolutionary, to say the least. Was there more to learn from this strange, untrained ex-bellhop? Indeed there was. As the news of the alliance between Eisenbud and Ted grew, the Denver psychiatrist was aware that the critics would soon come around. In a bid to prove the validity of these experiments, Ted was subjected to thorough searches. In some cases, he was stripped and searched in every way possible. His clothes were carefully inspected to be sure he wasn't hiding anything. At other times, he was given a specially prepared costume for the session. These costumes were usually searched by external parties. Ted was also made to carry out these tests under various conditions. All of these were in a bid to ensure that critics and naysayers had little or nothing to say about Ted's abilities. However, as much as Eisenbud wanted his sessions with Ted to be credible, he indulged his partner. For some weird reason, he was always allowed to consume as much alcohol as possible. Ted was a heavy drinker, and after almost 4 years of these Thoughtograph sessions, he had consumed thousands of quarts of alcohol. It is common knowledge that alcohol makes people drunk, but there's more to getting drunk. It is widely believed in certain sects that the human soul is always surrendered to something at every point. When people are sober, they are in control of their souls, emotions, and inner being. However, under the influence of alcohol, hard drugs, or hallucinogens, there is the possibility of the soul coming under a different spirit, or even demons. This is why some of the worst crimes are committed under the influence of drugs or alcohol. I mean, the cops wouldn't even let you drive under the influence of alcohol. In any case, Ted had lots of booze as he printed these images from his mind. He seemed to need the extra stimulants to get to the depths of his mind as he worked. Usually, he would contort his face and act around the whole place, sometimes screaming obscenities before shouting the word, "Now." This was the signal for the people holding the camera to take a shot. As expected, the alcohol affected his composure. Eisenbud sometimes had a hard time controlling him, but never stopped supplying him with liquor. From the plain black or white images that Ted initially printed from his thoughts, the photos improved. They went from whiteys and blackies to blurred images of actual things or places. This was the moment of breakthrough Eisenbud sought. The question on everyone's lips was how this drunk, unemployed man created these images.
A lot of these were in front of Denver-based researchers, and they would use marked packs of film, marked cameras. Sometimes Serios would touch the camera, and sometimes he wouldn't.
This image, for instance, was produced during one of their sessions. Although it wasn't always easy for Ted to photograph these images, he somehow always ended up with something that amazed his audience. Sometimes, eyewitnesses said that the sessions lasted over 5 hours. Eisenbud's alliance with Ted was unique. The psychiatrist was driven. He was interested in expanding the frontiers of the human mental experience. Ted was also sure he had a gift worth sharing with the world. As the time passed, the number of mentally formed images began to increase. One of his most intriguing mental image reproductions happened when he created a picture that looked like Eisenbud's ranch. This particular image is interesting because not only did it capture the ranch, but the final image added certain features that were not present at the time. Remember that all these pictures were produced within 60 seconds since they were taken by Polaroid cameras, so it's almost impossible for him to edit the image. In another event, Ted produced a picture of a delivery stable in Colorado. While the pictures look similar apart from the blurry Thoughtograph, there are a few details about these pictures. The walls in the original picture were built with regular brick, but the wall in the Thoughtograph is made of stones. The only logical explanation for this is to believe that this is how Ted thought the wall looked like. To better explain this, I like to assume that Ted's mind worked like our dreams. You know how dreams can go from obvious, easy-to-remember night times to weird, complex, and difficult-to-explain moments. Since Ted was drunk, it's possible that his mind produced unclear, wobbly images. There were even cases where he printed pictures that were a far cry from what he was supposed to do. However, even this was no easy feat. If anything, it proved that Ted had random pictures in his mind, and he could print them on Polaroid rolls. But it gets even more interesting. As the news got out that someone out there was mentally printing pictures, the long-awaited skeptics finally came around. This necessitated the use of even more extreme measures to convince them. Their first line of attack was directed at something that Ted did during the sessions. It was his closeness to the camera. Ted sometimes stood quite close to the camera, and in some cases, he even touched it. These acts were enough to suggest that Ted had something to do with the final printout of the shots taken. So, to put to bed such claims and suspicions, Eisenbud asked that Ted stay inside a charged Faraday cage. He also ensured the cameraman was outside the cage, and Ted still delivered. For some of the sessions, Ted was given something to think about on the spot and print from his mind, so that it wouldn't look like the camera came with the images already. And once again, Ted delivered. In other cases, he was allowed to do what he wanted, Although all sessions did not achieve 100% compliance, some of his thoughtographs left many spectators amazed. Despite all these showcases from Ted and Eisenbud with strict rules, the critics still didn't believe in them. They kept finding faults. In such, their suspicion grew bigger when they discovered that Ted never carried out his acts without a tiny roll of paper. It was his special gizmo that he used to focus and concentrate on what he was trying to recreate from his memory. But some critics thought it was something else to make the con possible. After 3 long years of mental printouts, bottles of alcohol, and more drama, Ted's final image was printed in 1967. This time, he produced curtains. Somehow, Eisenbud knew this might be Ted's last photo. To him, it meant the curtains had been drawn, and whatever gift Ted had to offer the world had been graciously received. Or had it? As with all unnatural occurrences, Ted and Dr. Eisenbud were criticized. It was simply unthinkable to believe that the mind could produce pictures, and they had their reasons. The major factor behind these pseudo-scientific events was an ex-convict. He had no education in psychology, psychiatry, or any of the sciences. These deficiencies were enough to cast doubts on whatever he claimed he was doing. I mean, if you were presented with the option of accepting the testimony of a drunk criminal or a sober scientist, whose testimony would you accept? Ted didn't have any worthwhile career. He was down and out, and trickery might have been the motive behind his thoughtographs. Is it possible that Ted finally realized that his life had no relevance in the scheme of things, and wanted to be known even if it meant pretending to have psychic powers? These are not conclusive thoughts, but questions that need to be asked. In all his sessions, Ted was subjected to thorough checks. However, his tiny gizmo was always with him. Over time, some of his greatest criticism came from this item. In a bid to explain how the images were printed, some of his critics said Ted hid tiny pieces of slides in his gizmo. However, since his hands were unstable and he was running around, in many cases twisting and moving, the pictures came out looking blurred. 2 men, David B. Eisendrath and Charles Reynolds, strongly objected to whatever Ted claimed to do. They were amateur magicians and came on shows to demonstrate what they believed Ted was doing during the sessions. They also wrote an article in a paper, The Popular Photography, describing in detail what they believed Ted did and how he fooled everyone with his gizmo. They believed Ted used his boisterous nature and alcohol to prevent the witnesses from paying any form of attention to what he was doing. Now, when you consider these allegations, they seem to add up. I mean, how do you pay any attention to a man's gizmo when he's running around in circles, shrieking, and even pulling off clothing items during the sessions? After all, the best trick for a magician will always be the distraction. These two come the closest to discrediting Ted's work. I hereby state that if before any competent jury of scientific investigators, photographers, and conjurers, any chosen by them, can in any normal way or combination of ways duplicate under similar conditions the range of phenomenon produced by Ted, I shall 1. Abjure from all further work with Ted, 2. Buy up and publicly burn all available copies of The World of Ted Serios, 3. Take out a full-page ad in Popular Photography in order to be represented photographically wearing a dunce cap, and 4. Spend my spare time for the rest of my life selling door-to-door subscriptions to this amazing magazine. No time limit is stipulated. Basically, if it was easy, or as easy as you claim it is, come do it. Prove me wrong. And no one came out to prove him wrong. But in 2002, a man came forward to reveal what he experienced during one of Ted and Eisenbud's sessions. This is what he had to say. 7 guests assembled the evening I was involved, a typical number for a group to witness a demonstration, according to Dr. Eisenbud. Each guest was asked to bring at least 5 rolls of 3000 speed Polaroid film. Dozens of exposures were made in the 2 cameras brought by Dr. Eisenbud. Serios would hold what he called a gizmo, a black paper tube about 1 inch in diameter and 1 1/2 inches long, to the camera lens. He would scream obscenities, contort his face, and sometimes yell, "Now," the signal for whoever was holding the camera to trip the shutter. He was chastised often by Dr. Eisenbud, but the doctor still continued to supply beer to Serios. The frenzy continued. The evening wore on. Still no thougtographs emerged from the multitude of developed images. Then, amazingly, after 5 long hours, 3 strange images arrived, after the 1 minute to process each exposure. Altogether, with the 2 cameras, he produced 6 blurry images unrelated to the room's environment. I was puzzled. He often displayed the gizmoso. We could see that it was empty, but in his drunken condition, he finally slipped up. Serios became careless. He was waving his arms and yelling. I saw a shiny object reflect from inside the paper gizmo that he always held to the camera lens. Fortunately, I kept my mouth shut when I saw the foreign object in the gizmo. I found out a week or so later that trying to debunk a hoax can make the debunker more the culprit than the perpetrator of the hoax. In all these, Eisenbud firmly stood by his convictions. He had watched Ted's evolution and seen things that were difficult to explain. In his book, The World of Ted Serios, he details his encounters with the mental photographer and their sessions. Although it is easier to lean towards Eisenbud's convictions because of his expertise, it must also be known that Eisenbud was obsessed with this form of unconventional psychology. This didn't exactly make him an objective judge. But he was about to meet his greatest opposition. One man was finally ready to lay the argument about Ted's ability to rest. Unfortunately, he was not a believer in his methods. Although Eisenbud believed in Ted's power and had reasonably demonstrated this over 3 years, critics persisted. One of them was a well-known magician, James Randi. Randi had earned a reputation for exposing magicians over the years. You know the role Morgan Freeman played in the hit movie Now You See Me? Randi did that for a living, and as a hobby. He was so good at what he did that he was called the Amazing Randi. He began as an illusionist and escape artist, but soon grew tired of the many psychics and mediums who were extorting money from their fans. In a bid to help them, Randi started a strong campaign against charlatans and people who claimed to be what they were not. It is believed that he challenged as many as 100 people while he was alive. From psychics to mediums to fake faith healers, Randi spared none as he exposed them whenever he could. One of his longtime targets was Uri Geller, the Israeli-British magician and illusionist who claimed he could bend metals with his mind. Randi's interest in Ted's supposed power grew. He believed he could expose him. He was convinced he knew how Ted manipulated his audience and was willing to show the whole world how the drunken thoughtography expert did it. Eisenbud gladly accepted this challenge. However, he laid down the terms of engagement. If Randi was sure Ted was a phony, he would have no problem replicating his results under the same condition. To name a few, he was supposed to get as drunk as Ted. He also needed to be willing to pose, naked or semi-naked, in a Faraday-charged cage, while replicating or disproving Ted's photos. I guess these conditions were too much for the amazing debunker, as he declined the offer. He stated that he was not a heavy drinker, but that only sounds very convenient, don't you think? Although lots of people criticized Ted and Eisenbud, it is worth noting that no one ever convincingly exposed him as a fake. However, these criticisms played a significant role in casting doubts on what Ted did. Interestingly, after his last picture in 1967, his mental ability abruptly stopped. 10 years later, Eisenbud and Ted reunited, but Ted couldn't seem to get anything to imprint on the Polaroid films. I'm not sure how Ted got those images to appear, but this is not the first time strange figures or beings would appear in a picture. Ted was probably just a medium. In fact, there is a story that is closely similar to Ted's own. In the same year that Ted began to mentally print out images, there was a family that also experienced some image alteration as well. They took a picture, and when it was developed, they saw something weird and crazy in the picture. And just like Ted, no one could prove what this family saw as fake. In the same year, 2 different people in 2 different locations could do this. Ted and now this family. Which makes me wonder if maybe there is more than meets the eye. You can watch it as well, and let us know what you think.